the best way to survive is, number one, to be a regional hegemon, and number two, to make sure you have no peer competitor, which is another way of saying you want to make sure you're the only regional hegemon on the planet. Right? So that's the basic theory. Now what I want to do is talk about the United States of America from 1783 to the present. And the argument I want to make is, if you look at how we have behaved over time, we have behaved according to the dictates of my theory. None of you have been educated to think this way because you grow up in liberal America, where we tell ourselves all these false tales about our history, where we're portrayed as noble people who do nothing but good on the world stage and so forth. So that's not the way it's operated over time. Let's go back to 1783. In the beginning, the United States was comprised of 13 measly colonies strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. What happened over the next 70 or so years is that the United States marched from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific Ocean. We murdered huge numbers of Native Americans. We stole their land. We went to war with Mexico and stole from them what is the southwest of the United States. We invaded Canada in 1812 for the express purpose of incorporating Canada into the United States. The British and the Canadians worried throughout the 19th century that we were going to pay them a return visit because they knew that we had a voracious appetite. Much of the Caribbean would today be American were it not for the slavery issue. The southern states were desperate to expand into the Caribbean, to make all sorts of territory in that part of the world, part of the United States of America. And what prevented it was the northern states did not want any more slaveholding states in the Union. As you well know, sugar was the main industry in the Caribbean, and sugar was a labor-intensive industry. That meant there were huge numbers of slaves in the Caribbean, and the northern states did not want more slave-holding states. So not only did we have our gun sights on the Pacific Ocean, we also had our gun sights to the north on Canada, and we had our gun sights to the south. There's no country in modern history that has a record of expansion that comes close to ours. It's no accident that when Adolf Hitler went into the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, for the next few months he talked frequently about doing in the Soviet Union what the United States did in North America. That's how the United States was created. A very powerful state, very aggressive state. Second thing we had to do to establish hegemony in this hemisphere is we had to get the European empires out. You all remember President James Monroe in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine, he basically told the European great powers, this is our hemisphere. We're eventually going to throw you out. We're not powerful enough to do it, but you're leaving. It's just a matter of when. And once you leave, you are not welcome back here. Again, there are enough of us in this audience to remember the Cold War. You remember how we used to go ballistic when the Soviets would do certain things in places like Cuba? Talk about putting missiles in Cuba, troops in Cuba, building a naval base at Cienfuegos. This was not acceptable to us. This was our hemisphere. We were bent on establishing regional hegemony. So my point is that by 1900, in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the United States had established regional hegemony. And as I said before, this is the only regional hegemon in modern history. Now, you have two goals. One is to establish regional hegemony, and two is to make sure there's no peer competitor. What happened in the 20th century? There were four potential peer competitors: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history. The United States had no intention of allowing any of those countries to dominate Europe, Asia, or in the case of the Soviet Union, Eurasia. We entered World War II World War I in April 1917, when it looked like the Germans might win that war, and we helped finish off the Germans. If I had an extra hour, I could give you my lecture on how I think the United States played the critical role in tipping the balance in favor of the French and British against the Germans. In World War II, we defeated Japan almost single-handedly, and we played a key role, although the Soviets played the key role, in defeating Nazi Germany in Europe. And of course, during the Cold War, we played the principal role in containing the Soviet Union, and then we helped usher it down the toilet bowl when the Cold War ended. And we were glad to see it go. And after it ended, we made it clear to the rest of the world that we had no intention of giving up American primacy. So the United States has a very clear record of not tolerating peer competitors. And we've actually been quite explicit about that. So the argument I'm making to you is if you look at the basic theory that I laid out, and you look at how the United States has really behaved since 1783, it fits very neatly with the theory. This brings me to the third part of the talk, which has to do with China. And of course, my argument is that China will imitate the United States. Now, let's just talk about maximizing relative power. Don't you think the Chinese, given their history over the past 150 years, understand the importance of really being powerful? You know what happened to the Chinese when they were weak? It was really quite terrible. They refer to it as the century of national humiliation. They had the Japanese, the Europeans, and the Americans with their open door policy, exploiting them left and right, occupying them, killing large numbers of people. You go to Beijing, you ask any person this simple question. You have two choices. You can be 10 times more powerful than Japan, or Japan can be 10 times more powerful than you. Do you think it matters? What do you think the Chinese are going to say? The Chinese are going to tell you it is very important to be very powerful. We understand what happened in the past when we were weak. So they will go to great lengths to maximize their relative power. They will want to make sure that the power gap between them and Russia, them and Japan, them and India is as wide as possible. Just like we're very content with the fact that Canada and Mexico and Guatemala are small fish compared to us. It's not because we're evil. It's because it's the best way to survive in the international system. So number one, you could expect the Chinese to want to maximize their relative power, to grow and build a powerful military. Second, you don't think the Chinese are going to have a Monroe Doctrine? You think it's okay for us to be terribly upset when the Soviets send troops or missiles to Cuba, but they shouldn't get upset when we run aircraft carriers or aircraft up and down their coast because we're a benign hegemon or some nonsense like that. My mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. The same basic logic that applies to us should apply to them. Why shouldn't they want a Monroe Doctrine? If I were the national security advisor in Beijing and they asked me whether or not we should work hard to have our own Monroe Doctrine and push the Americans out beyond what they call the first island chain or beyond what they call the second island chain, I'd do everything I could to push the Americans out. I'd want to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. Is that because the Chinese are evil? Is it because they have a different culture than we do? Absolutely not. My argument here, as you've all surely figured out, is a structural argument. The structure of the international system leaves you little choice when you're powerful but to try and dominate your region of the world. So you read the newspapers over the next 20, 30 years, you'll see lots of evidence of the Chinese talking about dominating Asia, about pushing the Americans as far away as possible. Because they're not going to be happy about our aircraft carriers and our aircraft and our ground troops sitting on their doorstep for the same reason we're never happy when anybody does that to us.